Hey everybody, welcome to Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith. Pleasure to be joined today by David Kamp. He's got his brand new book, Sunny Days, all about the American television revolution when it comes to children's programming. How are you, man?
I'm doing really well, DJ. Thanks for having me.
So you've written some books in the past, but we get the deep dive here on Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, really the transformational TV shows for a lot of people in their childhoods, and they've obviously had a huge impact. So what was it like putting this book together?
Well, it kind of occurred to me that I grew up in a special era. When I was a little kid, these shows were new, and I never thought of them this way until I was an adult. But like Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street and some of the other programs like Free to Be You and Me and Schoolhouse Rock and The Electric Company, together they weren't just a slate of children's TV programming. They were kind of a social movement that was trying to establish a kind of new vision of American childhood, more enlightened, more carefree, more fun.
Do you remember how old you were when you first started watching some of these shows?
I'm going to age myself, but I was there, DJ, day one of Sesame Street,
Wow.
November 10th, 1969.
Mm.
I was right in that demographic of kids, preschoolers that it was aimed at.
Well, I think it's really interesting because it's one thing for these shows to be on TV. It's another thing, like you said, to really change the fabric of the country. So, with Sesame Street specifically, what did that show do, and why do you think it resonated so much?
Well, one thing it did that was unique, and it wasn't even the primary objective back then, was it introduced the idea of diversity and multiculturalism to American audiences. When Sesame Street aired in 1969 for the first time, it was the blackest TV show on television. You have to remember that Black people were not frequent actors and guest stars on TV. Jet Magazine in those days, the Black Weekly, actually had a page, the back page of each issue, that was Black people appearing on TV this week. And it'd be like Nichelle Nichols on Star Trek, Sammy Davis Jr. will be on the Merv Griffin show. So for Sesame Street to suddenly have Gordon and Susan, those characters, on 5 days a week, that was a sea change. And if you were a Black kid watching at home, for the first time, you could see a version of yourself on the screen. If you're a white kid watching at home, you are having this introduction to Black culture that theretofore you might not have had.
Representation is so important. We talk about it so much today, but especially in the 60s, especially in the 70s. And for that show, I mean, the legacy lives on. What do you think is most special? I mean, what surprised you the most when you started to do some of this research for the book?
Well, what was most surprising is that they always regarded these shows, Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, as experiments. No one was making these shows with a view that they would last for 50 years and they would be judged by posterity. Sesame Street, especially, Joan Gans Cooney, who founded the show, she said it's an experiment and we're going to get things wrong. And when we get things wrong, we're going to admit it and course correct. And that's something I wish that we saw more of in today's leaders, just flat out saying, I got something wrong. Like the Muppets, the Count was too scary at first, so we made him less scary. Or Hispanic groups said, we're not represented, we need people. And that's how you got the characters of Maria and Luis, who then were on the show for 40 plus years. This idea of learning as you go and kind of being open about that process.
We don't really get the trial and error anymore, right? It's either you're on the air or you're off the air. And it seems like there's a void when it comes to some of this children's programming, or even something like Mr. Rogers, right? There's nothing that's really been replicated like that. Why do you think that is, and what made that show unique in your opinion?
I think part of it is the rigor with which it was prepared. A lot of people think that Fred Rogers was just this beatifically kind man who just happened to be a weirdo who spoke like this. But he was actually a fiercely intelligent man, DJ. And one thing that he really took seriously was child psychology, which was then in its relative birth, in the 1960s. And he prepared every episode of that program in consultation with a woman named Dr. Margaret McFarland, a pediatric psychiatrist. And so there's so many things in that show that are not just randomly planned out. They're really deliberate. Like when he comes in that door singing, "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood," and he walks screen left to screen right. That's because when a kid, reading English anyway, is learning how to read, your eye scans left to right. And when they take that trolley to the neighborhood of make-believe, that's because nursery school age kids have real trouble with transitions, like the transition from the classroom to the activity room or the lunchroom. Little kids, they cry, well, I don't want to go. And so that trolley was a way of making a transition gentle and understandable to children. That's how much forethought went into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
That's really fascinating. If Mr. Rogers was still around and you could talk to Fred, what would you want to know from him?
Well, I want to know what a lot of people think. We seem more polarized and divided than ever. And how do you bridge that gap? And I think part of him would say, you have to just achieve an understanding, put yourself in the other person's shoes, or at least know that everyone was once a child, because that was his thing. Everyone has experienced the hurt and the euphoria of being a child. And if you get in touch with that, you can solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you put it that way. I think another interesting thing is just the power of television at that time in the 60s, and obviously Mr. Rogers later on. We have so many things distracting us right now, whether it's social media, people on TikTok, TV is not the same as it was. What do you think about the state of children's television today? Can it still have this transformational impact, in your opinion?
I think it needs to have this transformational impact, because one thing we've learned from this pandemic is that screens are still being used to teach. We all have to go into remote learning and distance learning. And I felt really bad for all the teachers in the year 2020 who had to muddle through an improvised approach to suddenly teaching through screens. Whereas Sesame Street, there were 3 years of preparation before a single episode went on the air. And I think that, for a generation at least, it's going to be in the back of everyone's minds. We could go into lockdown again as coronavirus variants come around again. Maybe we'll have to lock down just for 2 weeks, but it could happen again. So I think we're going to have to acclimate to having some kind of really awesome screen-based curriculum that's a lot better than the sort of improvised response we had the last year or so.
Childhood is such a tender time, and to not have shows like this, you just wonder how different childhood is today compared to when you were a kid. And so I think the thing to ask here is that if you could sit a kid down who's never seen Mr. Rogers, never seen Sesame Street, what are the most important things you want them to take away from watching?
That these are adults who are interested in you, and they're not talking at you, they're engaging with you. What these shows had was a sensitivity to kids' emotional intelligence, meaning they weren't just showbiz. They weren't trying to sell products. They weren't like those 1950s shows like Howdy Doody, where it's like people going like, hey, we're coming at you, woo! It's kind of that you're being respected for who you are, and that you have a mind, and you're not this passive receptor of junk. You're a smart person, and we know that.
I think it would behoove us to listen to our kids a little bit more. And I think this book certainly speaks to that. So, David, really nice to meet you. Appreciate the time, man. And best luck to everything going forward, right?
Thank you, DJ.